Good morning, church. It's good to be with you today. Thoreau, in his journal, wrote, "The question is not what you look at, but what you see." This quote has been on my mind for a while, but I've been thinking about it even more in the last several weeks after the horrific death of George Floyd, the third in a string of senseless killing of people of color, and the protests that have been taking place around the world and within our city. The sentiment behind this quote from Thoreau is that he wanted people to not only look at nature, but to truly see it. Thoreau wants us to understand that it is often the unseen or the perceived that is far more important than the seen or input from our eyes. We must take in the world around us with our mind's eye rather than just our physical eye. I would add to this, as Christians, we need to take in the world around us with God's eyes and heart. If you have your Bible, our scripture reading for today is Genesis 16, verses 1 through 13, and I will be reading from the NIV translation. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So, after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Skipping to verse 13. Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, El Roi, "You are the God who sees me." For he said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." El Roi, the God who sees. What a profound experience that must have been for Hagar. Here she is, a slave who has been taken advantage of by Abram and mistreated by Sarai, a marginalized woman alone in the desert. I can only imagine how scared, lonely, and unloved she must have felt, wondering, does anyone care about me? And then God shows up and calls her by name. He sought her out and arrived at the moment of her greatest need and reassured her that she was seen, that she was loved and not forgotten. When we are alone, dying in an emotional wilderness, we can be comforted and encouraged to know that El Roi always sees and always understands as he meets us in our suffering. The reason for this is so that he can reach out to us and help us. God sees us in order that he may show us compassion, give us comfort, and work on our behalf. God seeing us is an extension of his love for us. As Christians, living out the mission of God in the world, we are called to extend the same love we have received from Christ to others. Just as we have been seen by God, we are called to see others. We are commanded to see all people, but particularly those on the margins. How are we as individuals and as a local and global church doing with carrying out that command? El Roi sees us, all of us, not just one story of who we are. This is a gift because there are some not so pleasant parts of me and some not so pleasant parts of my story. Yet God still loves me. And He loves you and your not so pleasant parts as well. Are we extending that same grace and love to others? Or are we holding on to biases and only seeing one part of their story? In the Bible, we have done a great job of seeing all of Peter. We see him as a great man of faith, the rock upon which God built His church. We also recognize and acknowledge the times when he fell short, like when denying Jesus 3 times in the garden. All of these experiences, not just one single event, make Peter who he is. Thomas, on the other hand, is not so fortunate. We know him as Doubting Thomas because he made what I personally think is a pretty valid request given the circumstances, to see the nail marks in the hands of Jesus and to put His hand in His side. We forget that when Jesus told the disciples they were going to Judea to see Lazarus, while some disciples questioned the safety of the excursion, in John chapter 11 verse 16, Thomas proclaimed, "Let us also go, that we may die with Him." Unfortunately, we usually forget that part, and we see Thomas through the single story of doubting the resurrection of Jesus. As we watch the protests happening here in Salt Lake City and around the world, are we seeing more than a single story? Are we recognizing the pain and anger behind the protests of people of color who have been suffering prejudice, racism, and injustice for far too long? Are we guided by prayer, reading stories of people on all sides, trying to understand their perspective? Or are we stuck in our old single narrative? Are we doing the hard work of looking inward and asking God to search our own heart and reveal our prejudices and biases? Are we seeking to understand where we have, whether knowingly or unknowingly, contributed to injustice and division? Are we seeking God's guidance on how to build bridges and create unity rather than division between people not just of different races, but also those of different sexual orientations, socioeconomic statuses, cultures, and ideologies? It's hard. But as Coach Jimmy Dugan says in the movie A League of Their Own, the hard is what makes it great. That type of hard, intentional, painful work of unifying rather than dividing, of seeing and valuing all people, loving them with the radical love of God, is kingdom work. It's what Jesus did. And as we live incarnationally as His followers, it is the hard, slow, intentional work of God that we are called to join Him in doing. I was listening to a friend's sermon this past Sunday. In it, he told the story of Reverend Will Campbell. Campbell was a white Baptist minister in Nashville, Tennessee, who worked with the civil rights movement during the 1960s. One of the many things that he did was attend trials. During those trials, when there was a break, Campbell would go over and speak with the family that had lost a loved one, often to a lynching, and minister to them. He would then cross the aisle and speak to the Klan member who had perpetrated the act and minister to him in the same way. When a reporter asked him how he could do such a thing, he said, because they, like all of us, are made in the image of God. When the reporter was not satisfied with the answer and pressed further, Campbell said, "I can do this, minister to both sides in the same way because I'm a Christian." When we stop dividing the world into categories of skin color, political parties, sides of town, gender, sexuality, age, fill in the blank other label we use to define a person, and recognize that all people are made in the image of God, we can live as Christians and begin pursuing the peace that we all so long for by engaging with and listening to those who are different from ourselves. As we break down these barriers and biases, we can begin to recognize that we live in an interconnected society, and that the voice and presence of all people matters. As we recognize the inherent value of each individual person made in the image of God, we can move from a sympathetic love, one that says, I'm doing this because I feel bad for you, to an empathetic love, one that says, I'm doing this because your pain is also my pain, because we belong to each other. We cannot move from sympathetic to empathetic love until we recognize that we do not serve others, but rather we are in mutual kinship with them. Jesus, as Father Greg Boyle says, was not a man for others. He was one with them. There's a world of difference in that, Father Greg suspects. And I agree. If kinship were our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we would be celebrating it. Now, kinship, moving from a posture of us and them to one of us and us, is not easy. I have really been struggling over the last several weeks with a multitude of things, to the point of a paralysis that makes me want to disconnect from the world and go live by myself in a cabin in the mountains. One of the many things I've been struggling and thinking a lot about is how to live in kinship with those who perpetrate acts that are downright evil. How do I see those people as made in the image of God, and that we are connected, and that there is more to their story than this act? In a less extreme example, lately I've been struggling with how to be in kinship with people I know, fellow Christians, who are expressing views that are contrary to mine, or are reacting to what is going on in ways that I just can't understand, or are not speaking at all to what is happening in our nation and city. I have frankly been tempted to put up a wall, let that one post or comment be the whole story of their view on the matter, and be done with it. That would be the easy thing. That would be the comfortable thing. But therein lies the problem. We have done what is easy and comfortable for far too long. Being a follower of Jesus is not easy, and it is not usually comfortable. Jesus and his followers were living counterculturally, doing the hard thing to bring about the peace, reconciliation, and redemption that the world needed then and still needs today. As the disciples followed Jesus and their faith grew, it changed how they perceived and interacted with the world. Our faith in following Jesus should be doing the same. God sees us as we are, so we must also seek to see others as they are, beloved and made in his image. Sometimes, seeing looks like sitting down and having an uncomfortable conversation. Listening to someone else, not with the goal of speaking a rebuttal, but instead with the goal of listening to understand. If we want to reimagine the world and transform it with the radical love of Christ, we need to begin to see people by engaging with the world, particularly with those who are different from ourselves. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "We need to have a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other." With that spirit in mind, I want to share with you a quote I read in one of our local papers from Salt Lake City Police Chief Mike Brown. He said, "It's too easy to hate from afar, to misunderstand from afar. But when you come together and shake hands and experience each other's humanity, it changes things." I agree. So I think the first thing we need to do is pray that God reveal to us the biases in our own lives that are barriers to us engaging with others. Next, we need to be intentional about seeking out and developing relationships with those who are different than ourselves and view the world through different lenses. As we develop a mutual kinship, we can begin sharing in one another's stories, being careful to hold these stories with love and gentleness, because the storyteller is beloved. We will never fully understand what it's like to walk in another person's shoes, but now, more than ever, we need to begin the hard work of coming together and trying to understand. We are living in a season of upheaval, where we have not fully left the past, and it is not clear what the future holds. The world is being reimagined, and cities are quickly adapting and evolving. I'm afraid that rather than being at the forefront of a movement that reimagines our world, the church is a monument stuck in the past, holding on to old perspectives and ways of engaging with the world. Mother Teresa said, "If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other." What kind of peace could be restored to our city if we not only proclaim that fact, that we belong to each other, but we live a life that demonstrates it? What would happen if we didn't just look at the world, but we saw the world, the way Thoreau spoke about seeing nature, but in an even more powerful way, because we are taking in the world through God's eyes, seeing His image in all people? As I struggle to make sense of all that is happening in the world, and as I seek God's guidance on how and where to respond, I find myself sitting in tension. As I cry out in anger, frustration, and sadness, I find, coupled with that, is a strand of hope woven within my lament. As Joe Saxon said recently in an interview, hope still wins, but it often has a tear-stained face. It has a vulnerable heart. It has bloodied fists because it keeps on fighting. It has scraped knees because it keeps on crawling forward. Hope is not necessarily pretty, but you always want hope on your side, because hope will fight for you. Hope will fight for the hardest parts of your life. We serve the God of hope, a God who is at work in the world and is inviting us to join Him in the work of redemption, unity, reconciliation, and restorative justice. It's time for us to step out from behind our monuments and join the movement of God in our city. Church, aptly named Movement Church, there is hope for change, and I think we are moving in the right direction. But we can do better. We need to do better. We serve El Roi, a God who doesn't simply look at us, but sees us, all of us. As followers of Jesus, it is time to dismantle the monument and lead the movement that seeks peace in our city by embracing mutual kinship with the reminder that we belong to one another, that all of us have more than a single story and are made in the image of God. It's time to see with eyes not our own. It is through the embracing and practice of this mutual kinship, of truly seeing others, that real, lasting transformation can take place within our individual lives and within our city. It's not what you look at, it's what you see. May we see not with our own eyes, but with the eyes and heart of God.